The last thing anyone heard from Ranger Frank Mercer was a single sentence spoken into a radio at 2 a.m, on a mountainside where he should have been completely alone. He had gone up to bring a lost boy home, a simple rescue, the kind of thing he had done 100 times in his 14 years with the park. But at 2 a.m, on the night of October 9th, 1961, his voice came through the base station one last time. He said, "It was already here before us. It was already waiting for us." Then the radio went quiet, and Frank Mercer was never seen again. The search that followed lasted 11 days. It found the boy Frank had climbed up to rescue, alive, sitting at the bottom of a ravine with no memory of the night. It found Frank's flashlight still switched on. It found his boots placed neatly side by side at the mouth of something the old survey maps of the Smokies refused to name. But it never found Frank. And the report that was eventually filed, the official one, the one stamped and sealed and locked in a county records room for 60 years, does not match a single word of what the search party saw with their own eyes that week. This is the story of what was already waiting in the Great Smoky Mountains, and why the people who drew the maps of this country spent so much effort pretending it had never been there at all. Frank Mercer was not a superstitious man. The people who worked with him described him the same way over and over in the years afterward. Steady, quiet, the kind of ranger who read the weather like a book and never lost his footing, even on the worst ridgeline in the worst rain the mountains could throw at him. He had grown up in the foothills, in a small town that has since been swallowed by the park boundary. He knew the Smokies the way you know the inside of your own house in the dark. So when the call came in on the evening of October 8th about a 19-year-old hiker named Peter Voss, who had not returned from a day walk near a stretch of high ground, the locals called the Black Fern Cut, nobody hesitated to send Frank. The Black Fern Cut was not on the tourist trails. It was a narrow saddle of rock between two peaks, and the path up to it wound through a section of forest that even experienced hikers tended to avoid, not because it was dangerous in any ordinary way, because it felt wrong. People who walked through it described a heaviness in the air, a silence too complete, a sense that the trees were older and taller than trees had any right to be that high on a mountain. Frank had been up there before, and the one time anyone ever recorded him saying anything strange about his job, it was about that place. A colleague remembered him coming down from the Black Fern Cut years earlier, pale, and saying only that the ground up there did not sound right when you walked on it, that underneath the leaves and the soil, when you stamped your boot, it rang, like there was something hard and hollow beneath the mountain. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Old mountains have caves, old mountains have stone. But there was one more thing about the Black Fern Cut that Frank knew, and most people did not. In his 14 years working the park, 3 other people had gone missing on that same short stretch of ridge. Not many, spread out across more than a decade, each one easy to write off on its own as an accident on hard terrain. But Frank had kept a private list. He told his wife once that the cut took someone every few years quietly, and that the park never connected the cases because no 2 of them were ever filed by the same office. He did not like going up there alone after dark. On the night of October the 8th, he went up anyway. He brought a radio and he checked in every hour like he was supposed to. And around midnight, his check-ins started to change. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the Rangers erased 1961 case file, the coordinates the search party was ordered to avoid, the photographs the county sealed for 60 years, the names of the 4 men who signed the original report and then quietly rewrote it word for word. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. To understand what happened to Frank Mercer, you have to understand what was under the Smoky Mountains long before Frank ever put on a ranger's uniform. And to understand that, you have to be willing to ask a question the history books never let you ask out loud. Who built the foundations that were already there when the park was made? Because the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was not carved out of empty wilderness. When the survey crews and the work camps of the Civilian Conservation Corps moved into these hills in the 1930s, they did not find untouched forest. They found stonework, they found walls, they found long straight lines of dressed granite running through the trees, some of them half swallowed by earth, as if the ground itself had risen up to bury them. The official story was simple. Old settlers, old farmers, Cherokee sites, nothing that could not be explained, and most of it was quietly cleared or left to be reclaimed by the forest or written up in a report that no member of the public would ever read. But some of the men who did that clearing told a different story when they got old. They talked about foundations too large and too precise to have been laid by any mountain farmer. They talked about stone cut so cleanly that the blocks fit together without mortar, blocks so heavy that even with modern equipment they could barely be moved. They talked about arches and drainage channels and what looked like the buried courses of streets running under a mountain that was supposed to have never held a city. One of them, a man who had spent 2 summers in a work camp near the ridge, described being ordered to fill in a stone-lined channel that ran arrow straight for what he swore was more than half a mile before it disappeared under a hillside. He said it had been engineered, sloped, fitted, the work of people who knew exactly what they were doing. And he said the foreman who gave the order did not want it measured, did not want it photographed, and did not want anyone talking about it in town. They were told it was an old mill race. He knew mills. It was not a mill race. Another remembered a section of wall that the crew uncovered by accident, standing more than twice a man's height, made of the same tight-fitted granite, curving gently as if it had once wrapped around something. They cleared it, logged it as a settler ruin, and then, within days, were pulled off that part of the site entirely and reassigned. When one of them went back to look a month later, the whole section had been buried again under fresh fill, and the paperwork listing it had gone missing. No one ever explained where the record went. Not ever. This is the piece of history that the people who believe in Tartarian point to. The idea that before the country we were taught about, there was another one. An older civilization spread across the whole world, advanced in ways we do not fully understand, and then erased. Wiped from the maps, buried under a story of empty land and humble beginnings. Its buildings repurposed, its cities filled in with mud and soil and quietly renamed, its very existence turned into a thing you are not supposed to say in polite company. You do not have to believe every version of that idea to notice something strange in the Smokies. The maps of these mountains were redrawn again and again in the early 20th century. Ridgelines that had names in the 1800s appear on later maps with no name at all. Whole features simply vanish from the record. And the Black Fern Cut, the place Frank Mercer climbed to on his last night alive, is one of them. On the oldest survey of the region there is a mark at that exact spot. A small square drawn by hand with a single word beside it that later mapmakers scratched out so thoroughly that no one today can read what it said. Something was there. Something old enough and important enough that a surveyor felt the need to record it, and something that someone later felt the need to erase. And this is the part that the believers find impossible to let go of, because it is not just one square on one old map. Across the whole range, the same pattern repeats. Names that appear on charts from the 1800s are simply gone from the versions printed 50 years later. Features are relabeled. A place that was once marked as a structure becomes, on the newer map, nothing but a bend in a contour line. It is as if a decision was made somewhere that the memory of certain places was more dangerous than the places themselves. And the Black Fern Cut sat at the very centre of that quiet, patient work of forgetting. Frank Mercer walked up into that erased place on the night of October 8th, and at midnight, when he made his hourly check-in, the man at the base station wrote down that Frank's voice had changed. He was speaking more slowly. He said the boy's trail had led him higher than he expected, past the tree line, to the mouth of what he called an opening in the rock. Not a cave, he said. Too square to be a cave. And he said the ground up there was ringing under his boots, louder than he remembered, like he was standing on the roof of something enormous and hollow. Before we move on to the descent, stop for a second. What you just heard about the opening in the rock is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original 1961 survey map. The scratched out square, the ringing ground, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. At 1 a.m, Frank checked in again. And this is where the official report and the memories of the men who were actually in that base station begin to split apart. The official report says that Frank reported finding Peter Voss and beginning his descent. Clean, simple, a rescue in progress. But the man who was on the radio that night, a younger ranger who left the Park Service not long after and spoke about it only once before he died, remembered something else entirely. He remembered Frank saying that he had found the boy at the mouth of the opening, that Peter Voss was sitting there in the dark, not moving, staring into the rock. And when Frank called out to him, the boy did not turn around. He only said very quietly that he could not leave yet, that the thing inside had not finished with him. Frank asked him what thing, and according to the man on the radio, there was a long silence. And then Frank said, in a voice that did not sound like his own, that he could see it now too, that it was standing just inside the opening in a doorway that had no business being on a mountain, carved into stone that no settler had ever cut, and that it was very old and very patient, and that it had been watching the men come and go on this mountain for longer than there had been a country to send them. That was when Frank said the sentence that ended up in the newspapers, the only part of that night the public was ever allowed to hear. It was already here before us, it was already waiting for us. And then, at 2 a.m, the radio went dead. The search party reached the Black Fern Cut on the second day. What they found there was never fully described in the official record, but the men who climbed up talked about it for the rest of their lives, in low voices, to people they trusted. They found Peter Voss first, but not where Frank had said he was. The boy had somehow made his way down into a ravine on the far side of the ridge, more than a mile from the opening, and he was alive and physically unharmed and completely unable to say how he had gotten there. He had no memory of Frank at all. When they told him a ranger had come up to save him, he looked at them like they were speaking a language he did not know, and then they climbed the last stretch to the opening in the rock, and they understood why the old maps had refused to name it. It was a doorway, not a cave mouth, not a crack in the granite, but a true doorway, cut square and clean into the face of the mountain, framed by blocks of stone fitted so tightly that the men could not slide a knife blade between them. Above the frame there was carving, worn almost smooth by time, but still just visible. Patterns that none of them recognized, and the ground in front of it, when they stepped onto it, rang hollow under their boots, exactly the way Frank had described. They found his flashlight there, standing upright, still shining. They found his boots placed side by side, laces tucked in, as neat as if he had set them down before bed. And beyond the doorway they found darkness that their own lights would not fully enter, a darkness that seemed to drink the beams and give nothing back. 2 of the men went inside. They were in there for less than a minute. When they came out, one of them was weeping, and the other never spoke about it again, not once, for the rest of his life. Whatever was in there, they refused to describe it. The only thing one of them ever said, years later, was that it was not empty, that something was still in there, and that it had looked at them the way a man looks at insects that have wandered into his house. The one who wept said a little more, but only to his own family, and only near the end of his life. He said the space beyond the doorway was far larger than the mountain could possibly hold, that he had stepped through expecting a cave, a few feet of rock, and instead found himself standing at the top of a stair that went down into a hall so vast his light could not reach the far side of it. He said there were shapes down there in the dark, standing in long rows, too regular to be natural and too still to be alive, and he said that one of them far below had slowly turned its head to look up at the light. That was the moment the two of them ran. They did not go back in. They took Frank's boots and his flashlight, and they carried the boy down the mountain, and they filed off the ridge as fast as the terrain would let them, and within a week the doorway in the Black Fern Cut had been dealt with in the way these things always seem to be dealt with. Sealed, collapsed, reported as a natural rockfall, removed from the record as thoroughly as its name had been scratched off the map 100 years before. The official report, the one locked away for 60 years, states that Ranger Frank Mercer died in a fall while conducting a rescue, that his body was never recovered due to difficult terrain, and that no unusual features were present at the site. Every man who was actually there knew that every part of that sentence was a lie. But they signed it, and then, according to the account that later came to light, 4 of them were brought back weeks later and made to rewrite even their own field notes word for word until the notes agreed with the story. It is worth sitting with that word for a moment. Rewrite. These were not clerks changing a date on a form. These were men who had climbed the mountain, who had seen the doorway with their own eyes, who had carried a dead friend's boots down the trail, and who were then brought into a room and made to put their own hands to a version of events they knew was a lie. Whatever was being protected up on that ridge, it was worth more than the truth about one missing ranger. It was worth the memory of every man who had ever stood there. That is the pattern the Tartaria idea keeps circling back to, not the buildings themselves, but the erasing. The sense that whenever something is found in these mountains that does not fit the official history, the response is never curiosity. It is always concealment, a rockfall, a settler's ruin, a terrain too difficult to search, a file sealed for 2 generations until everyone who remembered the truth was safely dead. So what was in the doorway? We will never know for certain, and anyone who tells you they do is guessing. But the people who study these erased places have a theory, and it is not a comfortable one. The theory is that the civilization that came before us did not simply vanish, that it was ended on purpose, and that whatever ended it did not leave. That in the deep places, under the mud and the renamed ridgelines and the buried streets, some of what that world contained is still there, still patient, still watching the men come and go on the mountains it used to own, and that once in a great while a man climbs too high and finds a doorway that was never meant to be found, and steps close enough to be noticed. There is a detail in the older accounts that makes this harder to dismiss than most stories of its kind. The men who sealed the Black Fern Cut did not simply collapse the entrance and walk away. According to the account that surfaced decades later, they were first instructed to record the exact position of the doorway, to note its dimensions and the pattern carved above it, and to hand those measurements to men who wore no park uniform and were never named. Whoever gave the orders did not believe the doorway was worthless. They believed it was important enough to catalogue carefully before they buried it. You do not measure a natural rockfall. You measure a thing you fully intend to remember long after you have made certain that no one else ever can. Peter Voss lived a long life and never hiked again. He told the same story until the end. He remembered nothing about the night on the mountain, nothing about the ravine, nothing about Frank. But he said that for the rest of his life, whenever he was somewhere very quiet, he would sometimes feel the ground go hollow beneath him, just for a moment, and hear something ringing far below. As if the roof of that enormous buried thing was still there under all of us, waiting. He never could say which was worse, the forgetting, or the distant patient ringing that always seemed to answer from somewhere far below. Frank Mercer's name is on a small memorial in the park, listed among the rangers who died in the line of duty. The date is right, the cause is wrong. And the mountain where he vanished is still there, exactly where it always was, with a stretch of high ground that no trail will take you to, and a place on the oldest maps marked with a small square and a name that someone made very sure you would never be able to read. If this story stayed with you, and if the idea of a history that was deliberately erased is one you want to follow further, there is another account on screen right now that goes even deeper into what the survey crews found in these mountains and why it was buried. Watch that one next. Because the doorway Frank Mercer found was not the only one. It was just the one where somebody finally climbed high enough to look inside,